Hello and welcome, fellow travelers, through the corridors of time. Today, we are embarking upon a truly monumental journey through the vast, sprawling annals of human history. We are not merely stepping back in time, we are venturing into the very mists of antiquity, the primordial crucible from which our complex modern world was ultimately forged. This is a world shaped and reshaped in the relentless crucible of ceaseless human migration, bitter, transformative conflict, profound cultural creation, and the slow, grinding, yet undeniable forces of environmental change. We are setting our compass for an age long before the familiar, sharply defined borders of modern nation-states solidified, before the very maps we use to navigate our planet were even conceived in their current recognizable forms, when political entities were fluid, constantly shifting, and often defined more by kinship than by fixed territory. We are traveling to the periphery of the known world as the classical ancients saw it, pushing beyond the great, gleaming, and heavily guarded river frontiers, the majestic Rhine and the mighty Danube, lines of demarcation that the meticulously engineered Roman Empire constructed and fiercely defended, perceiving them as the very boundary separating its ordered, civilized sphere from the vast, untamed wilderness beyond. We are plunging deep into the expansive, brooding, and seemingly infinite ocean of dense primeval forests, treacherous marshes, and windswept moorlands that constituted ancient Germania. This extensive territory, sprawling across vast tracts of northern and central Europe, was never a singular political entity unified by a single crown or a centralized capital city. Instead, it was a vibrant, living, breathing landscape inhabited by diverse peoples, a dynamic and ever-changing cauldron of distinct human groups, each with its own unique customs, its own chosen leaders, and its own burning ambitions. It was a sprawling, ill-defined realm that housed a constantly shifting mosaic of tribes and formidable confederations, whose names now echo like half-forgotten incantations from a lost and semi-mythical past. The Suebi, the Marcomanni, the Cherushi, the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Lombards, the Angles, the Saxons, the Burgundians, the Thuringians, the Alemanni, the Rugi, the Heruli, and countless others, each a thread in a complex tapestry. To the ordered, sophisticated, and urbanized mind of a Roman citizen, gazing out from the cold stone ramparts of a legionary fort or from the comfort of a bustling city plaza, these disparate groups were simply categorized by the pejorative term barbaripos, barbarians. They represented a terrifying, chaotic, and undifferentiated sea of perceived savagery, pressing relentlessly against the fragile, glittering shell of their refined civilization, a constant source of fear and anxiety. But that single dismissive label, barbarian, is a profound historical injustice. It functions as a veil of Roman propaganda, deliberately obscuring the vibrant, complex, and deeply human reality of who these peoples truly were. They were a dynamic, fiercely independent, and astonishingly resilient force of history, driven by an inherent vitality and a deep connection to their ancestral lands and customs, yet also remarkably pragmatic, adaptable, and capable of both learning and innovation. Their epic migrations, propelled by the inexorable pressures of fluctuating climate, by the ambitious visions of charismatic warlords seeking greater glory, by the alluring promise of Roman wealth and fertile lands, and by the sheer primal terror of even more fearsome invaders from the distant east. Their brutal yet innovative methods of warfare, honed over generations of relentless intertribal conflict and daring raids, and their rich, intricate, predominantly unwritten cultures expressed through oral tradition, art, and ritual, would, over the course of many tumultuous centuries, achieve the historically unthinkable. They would systematically dismantle the mightiest, most enduring empire the world had ever known, bringing its vast dominion to its very knees. And from its sprawling, magnificent ruins, they would, piece by bloody piece, lay the enduring foundations of the world we inhabit today, forging new polities and new identities. This is the grand, sprawling, and often breathtakingly violent saga of the Germanic tribes. From their murky prehistoric origins in the icy mists of the northern European plains, through their world-shattering, centuries-long confrontation with the disciplined legions of Rome, to the ultimate creation of the successor kingdoms that would in time, slowly but surely, evolve into the modern nations of England, France, Spain, and Germany itself, shaping their linguistic and cultural landscapes, we will meticulously trace the entire monumental arc of their incredible transformative story. This is not a simplistic binary tale of light versus darkness, or an easy dichotomy of civilization versus savagery. It is a far more intricate, far more nuanced, and infinitely more fascinating story of profound conflict and creative fusion, of catastrophic destruction followed by profound, world-altering creation. It is a narrative whose ancient threads are woven so deeply and inextricably into the very fabric of our modern languages, our legal systems, our fundamental social structures, our political geography, and even our most deeply held cultural identities, that to comprehend them is, in a very real and immediate sense, to understand a fundamental and often hidden part of ourselves. But before we immerse ourselves completely in the deep, dark forests of the past, I want to take just a brief moment to connect with you, the curious individual on the other side of this screen. It is your engagement, your deep curiosity, and your passion for understanding history that makes this entire endeavor not only possible, but profoundly meaningful. For me, history can often feel like a grand, impersonal narrative of distant kings and fallen empires, a remote subject, but it is ultimately the story of countless individual lives, each made up of countless individual days, just like yours, our own. Small stories are the intricate, vibrant threads that collectively weave the immense tapestry of our present time. So, if you would be so kind, I would be genuinely delighted if you would take a moment to go down to the comments section below and simply tell me how your day has unfolded. Was it productive, challenging, peaceful, perhaps even a bit mundane, or filled with unexpected excitement? Let's collectively create a small human tapestry of our own present moment before we commit ourselves so fully to the exploration of the distant past. And while you are there, I invite you to share one goal you have for your future. It can be a monumental life ambition that drives you forward, or a small personal step you are hoping to achieve tomorrow, a new skill to learn, or a place to visit. Reading about the aspirations that motivate the members of this incredible community is a profound and constant source of inspiration for me, fueling my own work. And finally, if you discover value and enjoyment in these deep, detailed, and immersive explorations of our shared human past, and if you appreciate the immense work, meticulous research, and genuine passion that goes into creating these videos, I would be deeply grateful if you would consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss future journeys into historical understanding. Your generous support is the vital fuel that allows me to continue making this content. It truly means the world to me. All right, let us now draw back the heavy ancient curtain of time and step into their world. Our great historical journey can now truly commence. Our story does not commence on the blood-soaked battlefields of the Roman frontier, the conventional starting point for many historical accounts that privilege conflict. To find its true source, the very headwaters of this immense river of migrating peoples, we must go much, much further back in time, delving into the mists of prehistory, and much further north in geographical terms. We must cast our minds back to the cold, damp, yet hauntingly beautiful landscapes of what is today southern Scandinavia, encompassing the islands and peninsula of Denmark, and extending across the vast coastal plains of northern Germany. We are entering the world of the Nordic Bronze Age. a distinctive and remarkably sophisticated cultural period that stretches back to approximately 1700 BC, predating classical antiquity. In this remote corner of Europe, far removed from the bustling, literate empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, or the burgeoning Greek city-states, a unique and vibrant society began to coalesce, innovate, and thrive. They were not yet Germanic in the precise linguistic or cultural sense we would later define them through Roman lenses, but they represent the deep ancestral rootstock, the proto-peoples, from which the later, more recognizable tribes would gradually spring. Their fascinating world is revealed to us not through any form of written script, for they did not possess it, but through the breathtaking and often enigmatic artifacts they left buried in the earth, meticulously crafted objects that speak volumes. These objects served either as precious offerings to their pantheon of deities or as eternal companions for their most powerful dead, entombed for the afterlife in monumental structures. Imagine for a moment the visceral experience of their soundscape. Picture hearing the distinctive, resonant calls of magnificent bronze lures, great, gracefully curved horns often found in perfectly matched pairs, sometimes over 2 meters long, their polished surfaces gleaming with a golden hue in the sunlight, being played from a mist-shrouded hilltop, their sound carrying for miles. Their deep bellowing and haunting calls would have reverberated across still lakes and silent, ancient hills, a primal sound that could summon the scattered clan to a solemn feast, a mournful funeral, or an urgent call to arms for war. It was the unequivocal sound of community, of authority, and of raw power, unifying disparate groups through its echoes. We can glimpse their cosmology, their complex understanding of the universe and its rhythms, in intricate golden discs, like the one discovered with the famous Trundholm sun chariot, meticulously embossed with complex hypnotic spirals and powerful sun crosses. These are the undeniable symbols of a pervasive solar cult, indicating a profound spiritual reverence for the life-giving day and night journey of the sun through the heavens, an entirely understandable obsession for a people whose existence was dictated by the long, dark, and unforgiving winters of the north, where the sun's benevolent return was a matter of survival and fervent celebration, the very pulse of life. The Trundholm chariot itself, a beautiful and evocative bronze and gold leaf model of a horse pulling the disk of the sun on a wheeled platform, is a stunning testament to a rich and complex mythology, a tangible representation of a belief that the sun was being perpetually transported across the sky by a divine helper, a cosmic drama that needed to be continually retold and reenacted in ritual to ensure the sun's benevolent return each day. Their developing social hierarchies are vividly hinted at in their sophisticated burial practices. Great earthen barrows, colossal man-made hills that required immense communal labor and sophisticated planning still punctuate the verdant landscapes of Denmark and Sweden, serving as eternal resting places for powerful chieftains and their families. These monumental tombs were not simply graves. They were powerful political statements etched onto the landscape, asserting ancestral claims to territory and lineage for generations, visible from afar and serving as undeniable territorial markers for all to see. And sometimes the unique anaerobic chemistry of the peat bogs gifts us an even more intimate and startling glimpse into their personal lives and beliefs. The oak coffin burial of the Egtved girl in Denmark, her body so miraculously well preserved after more than 3,000 years that we can still clearly see her fine woven string skirt, her elaborate bronze belt plate, her delicate bracelets, and even her intricately braided hairstyle, tells us of a high-status young woman. Astonishingly, chemical analysis of the strontium isotopes in her hair, teeth, and nails has revealed that she was not local to the area where she was interred, but had undertaken long, significant journeys back and forth from a region far to the south, possibly as distant as Germany's Black Forest, or even further. This single burial tells a compelling story of remarkable mobility, of sophisticated long-distance connections, of elite women traveling for strategic marriage alliances or extensive trade networks, and of a society far more complex and interconnected than we might initially imagine for this period. These were not isolated, self-sufficient peoples cut off from the rest of Europe. They were integral participants in a wider European network, actively trading precious northern amber, the fossilized tree resin they likely saw as solidified sunlight or the tears of the gods, both magical and beautiful, a rare commodity. For the essential raw materials of their age, copper from the Alps and tin from as far away as Cornwall in Britain, the vital ingredients for the gleaming bronze that defined their age, armed their elites, and connected them to a burgeoning continental economy. Their stories, or at least the evocative shadows of them, are carved into the great rock faces of places like Bohuslän in Sweden. These petroglyphs are a silent, sprawling, ancient movie of their world. They depict high, proud, elegant ships, clearly built for the open sea, often crewed by dozens of paddlers, suggesting a remarkable mastery of seamanship and coastal navigation, capable of long voyages. They show warriors brandishing axes and spears, sometimes in disciplined procession, sometimes in fierce combat. They reveal scenes of ritual, of farming, of great horned animals. It is a tantalizing but frustratingly incomplete window into a vibrant, dynamic, and long-lost world, a testament to a rich inner life and a sophisticated understanding of their environment and the cosmos. For over 1,000 years, this distinct Nordic Bronze Age culture thrived and evolved, continually adapting to its changing environment. But the world is never static, and climate acts as a ruthless, impersonal historical actor, shaping human destinies on a grand scale. Around 650 BC, a significant and prolonged shift in the climate occurred across northern Europe. The weather grew markedly colder, considerably wetter, and perpetually stormier. This climatic downturn, sometimes referred to by archaeologists as the Late Bronze Age collapse, or the climatic pessimum, and perhaps remembered mythologically in the chilling apocalyptic tales of the Fimbul Winter, the Great Winter, of later Norse lore that precedes the end of the world, put immense generation-spanning pressure on these northern peoples. The growing season shortened dramatically, threatening their agricultural base. Farmland that had once been productive became waterlogged and difficult to cultivate, severely reducing vital food yields and leading to widespread scarcity. Pastures for their vital herds shrank, threatening the very basis of their wealth and survival, leading to pressure for new lands and new resources. The population, which had grown and spread during the warmer, more stable Bronze Age, was now facing a profound long-term crisis of scarcity and environmental degradation. They had a stark choice: adapt rigorously to the harsher conditions by developing new technologies and agricultural practices, or migrate en masse to more hospitable lands further south. This climatic downturn was a powerful catalyst, driving a gradual but relentless migration southwards and westwards, marking the crucial transition to the pre-Roman Iron Age. It is during this extended period of forced migration and fundamental adaptation that we see the emergence of what archaeologists call the Jastorf culture, the direct ancestor of the historical Germanic peoples. It is here, in the material culture of these migrating peoples, the crucial shift from expensive, elite-controlled bronze to the far more democratic and readily available iron for making stronger tools and more effective weapons, marking a technological leap. Their distinctive and rather plain pottery styles, and their new settlement patterns, often characterized by the construction of more easily defended sites and a focus on resilience, that we can finally begin to speak with confidence of a cohesive Proto-Germanic people sharing a common language, a shared material culture, and a distinct evolving identity. They spread out across the vast North European plain, from the Netherlands in the west to the Vistula River in modern Poland in the east, laying the groundwork for the future Germanic tribal map and their distinct cultural spheres. Their society was overwhelmingly agrarian, their lives intrinsically tethered to the relentless turning of the seasons, a cycle dictated by the sun and the moon. Their year was an endless, arduous cycle of plowing the heavy, damp earth, sowing the hardy grains of barley and wheat, and frantically harvesting their crops before the swift, brutal onset of the northern winter, a constant race against time and the elements. The very heart of their world, the central organizing principle of their tightly knit society, was the iconic longhouse. This was a massive, rectangular, timber-framed building often extending over 20 meters in length, a testament to their sophisticated skill in carpentry and communal labor. Its walls were typically constructed of wattle and daub, a sturdy lattice of woven branches packed with a dense mixture of clay, soil, and animal manure that dried to a hard, insulating surface, and its roof was a thick, protective layer of thatch made from bundles of reeds or straw, ingeniously designed to shed water and hold heat. The longhouse was a microcosm of their world, a living, breathing entity constantly filled with the sounds and smells of life. Imagine stepping inside one on a bitter winter's day. The air would be thick with the acrid, pungent smoke from a central hearth that stung the eyes, its flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the massive timber posts that supported the roof. The sounds would be a rich tapestry of daily life. Women weaving cloth on warp-weighted looms, their rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the loom weights, a constant background drone. The murmur of conversation and storytelling through the long, dark evenings, passing down their ancestral lore. The occasional cry of a baby, and at the far end, separated perhaps by a low partition, the soft lowing, rustling, and shuffling of the cattle, a comforting presence. The smell inside would be a potent mix of damp wool, the musk of wet dogs, cooking porridge and fermented grain, and the pungent, unmistakable odor of livestock. For the longhouse was a single, shared space that sheltered not only the extended human family, the clan, but also their most precious possession, their animals. One end of the longhouse was dedicated to the people, for sleeping on raised platforms covered with hides, for eating communal meals, for crafts like weaving and tool-making, and for telling the sagas of their ancestors through the long winter nights, while the other end served as a byre for their cattle. The constant body heat generated by the animals provided a vital and continuous source of warmth. For the human inhabitants, a symbiotic relationship born of harsh necessity and practicality. Life was intensely communal, founded upon the foundational unit of the kin group, the clan. Your identity, your personal security, your accumulated wealth, and your very existence were inextricably tied to your kin. An insult to your third cousin was an insult to you. A crime against a member of your clan demanded swift and unified retribution from all of your relatives, creating a strong deterrent. Loyalty to kin was the paramount virtue, the unshakable glue that held their entire world together, ensuring mutual protection and survival in a dangerous competitive world, where alliances were often temporary and fragile. But what did these vibrant, dynamic people call themselves? What was the name they shouted as a fearsome war cry when they charged into battle, their spears bristling against the sky, their voices echoing through the trees? What collective designation did they use for their whole people, for their shared identity, for their sense of belonging and distinctiveness? We have absolutely no idea. All of their original names for themselves, their endonyms, are completely lost to the winds of time and the profound silence of a pre-literate age, buried beneath layers of later history and foreign labels. The powerful and enduring label, Germanic, the very word that now defines them in our modern history books, is an external construct, an exonym, a name imposed upon them by outsiders from the more developed lands to the south. It comes to us from the Romans, who, in their relentless organized expansion and their passion for classification, urgently needed a term to categorize the vast and bewildering sea of peoples living beyond their meticulously drawn and guarded frontiers, a way to make sense of the incomprehensible and to impose order on their perceptions. Our first truly significant written account of these people comes from the incisive pen of one of history's most consequential and self-aware figures, Gaius Julius Caesar. During his brutal, brilliant, and systematically executed conquest of Gaul in the 50s BC, Caesar's disciplined legions repeatedly came into contact and then into direct conflict with tribal groups from east of the Rhine River, whom he deemed distinct from the Gauls. He needed a clear and simple word to distinguish these newly encountered peoples from the various Celtic inhabitants of Gaul, whom he was in the complex and ongoing process of subjugating and integrating into the Roman sphere. In his masterfully written military and political propaganda piece, Commentari de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, designed both to inform the Roman Senate and to burnish his own image, he collectively calls them the Germani. The precise origin of this name is still hotly debated among modern scholars. Caesar may have borrowed it from a Gallic term for their eastern neighbors, a word which might have meant simply neighbors, or perhaps something more descriptive like the loud ones or the spearmen or even the truthful ones, implying a certain primitive honesty compared to the fickle Gauls. Whatever its specific etymological origin, for Caesar, and crucially for the Roman imperial psyche that he profoundly helped to forge and define, the Rhine River became far more than a mere geographical feature, a winding waterway. It became a powerful conceptual boundary, a stark ideological line drawn irrevocably on the map of the human mind. On one side was the Orbis Romanus, the ordered, predictable, civilized world of thriving cities, meticulously paved roads, codified, written laws, magnificent aqueducts, and disciplined legions marching in lockstep, a world of imperial order and supposed enlightenment. On the other side was the wild, chaotic, and menacing world of the barbarians, the vast untamed lands they simply called Germania Magna, or Great Germania, a land ripe for conquest but also deeply feared, a source of constant threat and unsettling fascination, a place of wild freedom. A century and a half after Caesar's initial encounters, another towering Roman intellectual, the historian and senator Cornelius Tacitus, would provide us with our most detailed, most famous, and most profoundly influential portrait of this intriguing world. His short but remarkably dense monograph, De Origine et Situ Germanorum, commonly known to us simply as Germania, written around the year 98 AD, stands as an ethnographic masterpiece of its time, a pioneering work of anthropological observation. However, it is also a deeply biased and profoundly problematic historical source that demands to be handled with extreme care and considerable skepticism by modern scholars. Tacitus himself almost certainly never set foot in Germania. His descriptions were based on second-hand accounts. His work was a brilliant literary synthesis, a compilation of various primary and secondary sources, military reports from the frontier, legions, anecdotal tales from merchants and returning Roman soldiers, stories gleaned from Germanic hostages or slaves living in Rome who had intimate knowledge of their homelands, and perhaps other, now lost, earlier written accounts that he all consulted. All of this disparate information was meticulously filtered through his own unique and powerful authorial agenda. Tacitus was, at his core, a moralist and a scathing social critic. He was a distinguished member of the Roman senatorial elite who looked upon the Rome of his day, even under the relatively stable and prosperous rule of the Emperor Trajan, with a complex mixture of patriotic pride and profound anxiety about what he perceived as its growing moral decay. He meticulously employed The Germanic peoples as a powerful rhetorical device, a potent moral mirror held up to his own society, a stark contrast to Roman vices. He constructed them as a kind of noble savage, an idealized archetype of primitive, uncorrupted virtue, in order to implicitly criticize what he saw as the insidious moral decay, pervasive corruption, effete luxury, and rampant decadence of contemporary Roman life. He praises their fierce, unyielding love of liberty and freedom, to shame Roman political sycophancy and submission to imperial power. He extols their strict sexual morality and the sacred sanctity of their monogamous marriages, to shame the widespread marital infidelity and low birth rates of the Roman aristocracy. He praises their simple, unadorned lives and disregard for material wealth, to shame Roman obsession with opulence and greed, portraying them as a purer, more virtuous alternative. Despite this powerful underlying agenda, Tacitus's work remains an absolutely priceless window into a world that would otherwise be almost completely silent to us, leaving us with only archaeological fragments to interpret. He paints a striking physical picture of the Germanic peoples, a description that would echo through centuries of European thought and even tragically shape later racial theories. Fierce blue eyes, reddish blonde hair, and large, sturdy bodies, powerful only for sudden exertion rather than sustained labor. He describes their society in fascinating and sometimes startling detail. It was not a unified nation, but a volatile, shifting patchwork of independent, often warring tribes, bound more by kinship and shared tradition than by centralized authority. He names many of them, providing us with a precious snapshot of the political geography of the time. The Chatti, renowned for their disciplined infantry and stern, unyielding demeanor, always ready for battle. The Suebi, a vast confederation of tribes distinguished by a unique and intimidating hairstyle, where the long hair of the free warrior was tied into a distinctive knot on the side of the head, a style specifically intended to make them appear taller and more terrifying in battle. The Cherushi, who would soon become infamous for their spectacular rebellion against Roman imperial authority. The Batavi, renowned as exceptional horsemen from the Rhine Delta, who would become elite and highly valued auxiliary troops in the Roman army, even serving as the emperor's personal bodyguard, a testament to their martial skill. At the head of each tribe was a king, a rex, chosen not by popular vote, but for the perceived nobility and purity of his bloodline. His authority stemmed from his divine or ancestral lineage. He was often considered a sacred figure, a living link to the tribe's glorious past and its ancestral gods, a mediator between the human and divine realms, and often a spiritual leader. Yet the king's power was far from absolute, especially outside of religious matters and ceremonial duties. For the specific and universally important purpose of war, the tribe would choose a leader, a dux, the Latin root of our modern word, duke, based not on inherited birthright, but on proven skill, demonstrated charisma, and undeniable personal bravery in battle, as these were the qualities needed to lead warriors effectively. The true heart of political power, however, the ultimate sovereign authority residing in the collective will of the people, lay with the assembly of all free arms-bearing men. This vital assembly was known to them as the Thing or Ding, a direct ancestor of modern parliamentary bodies. This was not a parliament in any modern sense of legislative bodies. It was a sacred and political gathering held at auspicious times, often during the new or full moon, in a hallowed open-air place, a consecrated grove of ancient trees, or an ancestral open plain, specifically designated for the purpose. Here, the warriors of the tribe would gather, fully armed for their weapons. Their spear and shield were the essential symbols of their status as free men, signifying their right to speak and fight, a mark of citizenship. They would listen intently. to the proposals of their kings and chiefs. 2. Show their approval. They would not shout or clap, but would vigorously clash their spears against their shields, creating a terrifying, thunderous roar of unified assent that would roll across the plain, a sound of overwhelming agreement. Disapproval, conversely, was subtly but clearly shown with a deep guttural murmur of dissent, a collective rumble of displeasure that could not be ignored. In the thing, they decided on the ultimate matters of life and death for the tribe. Whether to embark on a campaign of war or to make peace with their neighbors, they elected their war leaders for specific expeditions. They judged the most serious crimes like treason, desertion, and cowardice, dispensing justice directly, and they acted as a supreme court of customary law, administering justice for all, to see and accept, ensuring community cohesion. This legal system was not based on abstract written statutes or complex legal philosophy, as was the Roman system with its elaborate codes. Instead, it was a complex web of ancient unwritten custom, passed down faithfully through generations by oral tradition, and its primary purpose was intensely practical: to mitigate and control the devastating, society-destroying cycle of the blood feud. In their decentralized world, an injury or a killing was not a crime against an abstract state, but a profound offense against the victim's entire kin group, who were then honor-bound by tradition and social pressure to seek vengeance, or blutrecht, against the offender's kin, a cycle of reciprocal violence. To prevent this endless cycle of reciprocal killing from tearing their fragile society apart, they developed and relied upon the sophisticated system of the Würgild, literally man price. Every person in the tribe, from the highest noble to the simplest freeman, had a specific monetary value placed on their life, a value meticulously calibrated according to their social status and perceived worth within the community. If a man was killed, the killer's family was obligated to pay the victim's family the appropriate Würgild, which was usually paid in cattle, the primary measure of wealth in their pastoral society, or sometimes in other valuable goods. A nobleman was worth far more in Würgild than a freeman, and a freeman far more than a freed slave or a slave. This payment was a legally sanctioned and socially accepted substitute for bloody vengeance, a practical way to heal the deep wound in the social fabric and restore a fragile balance to the community, preventing prolonged warfare. Justice was also often administered through trials by combat, where the gods were believed to grant victory to the righteous party, proving their innocence through divine judgment or through various forms of ordeal, like plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying a piece of red-hot iron, where divine intervention in the healing process was sought to reveal guilt or innocence in situations of uncertain guilt. At the very core of their warrior society was the crucial institution of the comitatus, or war band, which Tacitus describes with great admiration as a superior alternative to what he saw as Roman military decadence and lack of personal courage. This was a band of elite young warriors who had sworn a powerful personal oath of loyalty to a charismatic and militarily successful chieftain. They were his companions, his personal household troops, his sworn shield brothers bound by unbreakable fealty and a shared destiny, a bond more potent than any written contract. The chief, in return, was obligated to be a figure of supreme generosity, a distribution of wealth essential for maintaining loyalty and prestige, attracting the best fighters. He provided them with their finest weapons, with swift war horses, with an honored seat at his feasting table in his great hall, where they would share abundant food and drink, and with a generous share of the spoils of war acquired from successful raids and battles. In return, they owed him absolute, unwavering loyalty in the heat of battle, a willingness to die for him without hesitation. It was the chief's sacred duty to be the bravest warrior in the fight, to always be at the very forefront of the action, leading by personal example and demonstrating his own courage. It was the sacred duty of his companions to match his valor, to fight fiercely beside him, and to protect him with their own lives, to never abandon him. For a warrior to survive a battle in which his chief had fallen was, according to Tacitus, a lifelong disgrace and infamy, a mark of unforgivable dishonor that would follow him forever, a stain on his reputation and his family. This intense, personal, reciprocal bond of loyalty between a lord and his sworn retainers was the very seed, the fundamental social DNA, from which the complex and layered hierarchies of medieval feudalism would one day organically grow, shaping the political landscape of Europe for centuries, their spiritual world, as we can painstakingly piece it together from Tacitus's observations, from later Norse literary sources like the Poetic and Prose Eddas, which, though later, preserve older traditions, from cryptic runic inscriptions found on various artifacts and memorial stones, and from the powerful, silent evidence of archaeological discoveries like bog bodies and weapon hoards, was as deep, dark, and mysterious as the primeval forests they called home. The famous Norse gods we know so well today, the complex, one-eyed wanderer Odin, the mighty thunder god Thor, the beautiful goddess of love and fertility Freya, are the later, more developed and literary versions from the Viking Age, filtered through centuries of storytelling. In the era of the Roman Empire, their pantheon was older, more elemental, and perhaps less clearly defined or systematized. Tacitus, attempting to make sense of their deities by comparing them to his own familiar Roman pantheon, tells us they worshipped Mercury, Mars, and Hercules above all others. Scholars are fairly certain that his Mercury, the guide of souls and patron of commerce, was Voronezh, the Furious One, a terrifying and enigmatic god of shamans, poets, magic, death, and the ecstatic fury of battle, the lord of the restless, dead, and the wild hunt, who would evolve into the great All-Father Odin. His Mars, the fierce god of war and justice, was likely Tiwaz, an ancient and once dominant sky god, the god of law, justice, and single combat, whose name is preserved for all time in our word Tuesday Tuesday. And his Hercules, the strong hero, was almost certainly Thunaraz, the Thunderer, the mighty red-bearded, hammer-wielding champion of mankind, a powerful and beloved defender of the cosmic order against the destructive forces of giants, and Chaos, who would become the Norse Thor, protector of the common man. But their faith was not confined to these great named deities who dwelled in some distant celestial realm. It was profoundly and pervasively animistic. They sensed the sacred imbuing the natural world all around them, seeing divine power in the landscape itself, in every tree and stone. They did not, Tacitus noted with some surprise and a hint of Roman approval for their apparent simplicity, believe in confining their gods within the walls of man-made temples or elaborate structures. They consecrate groves and woods, he wrote, and they apply the names of deities to that mysterious presence which they see only with the eye of the mind, meaning a spiritual rather than physical presence. Ancient trees, bubbling springs, deep rivers, and especially dark, still peat bogs were considered profoundly holy places, liminal zones that acted as direct portals to the divine realm, where the veil between worlds was thin. It was in these bogs that they made their most profound and sometimes horrifying offerings, often preserving them miraculously. Archaeologists have recovered vast votive deposits from these wetlands, deliberately broken weapons and war booty, precious metalwork, and most chillingly, human sacrifices. The famous bog bodies, like the almost perfectly preserved Tolland man in Denmark, whose face is so eerily intact that he seems merely asleep, were individuals ritually killed, hanged, strangled, or with their throats cut, and then carefully committed to the bog, perhaps as offerings to a fertility goddess to ensure a good harvest, or as punishments for grave social transgressions, or even as victims of political ritual. They deeply believed in and fiercely feared magic, both benevolent and malevolent, seeking its aid and fearing its curses. They developed a unique system of writing, the runes of the elder Futhark, which were not primarily for mundane communication, but were seen as having potent magical and divinatory power, each symbol carrying a specific esoteric meaning used in spells and prophecies. They sought to discern the will of the gods and the shape of the future by casting these marked runes, by listening intently to the songs and observing the flight patterns of specific birds, and by paying close attention to the snorts and neighs of sacred white horses, which were kept at the community's expense in the holy groves and seen as divine messengers. A particularly striking Germanic feature was their reverence for female prophets and seers, the volvas, or volur, women who could interpret omens and speak for the gods. Women like Veleda of the Bructeri tribe held immense political and spiritual authority in their societies, her pronouncements from her high tower treated as the very voice of a goddess speaking through her, guiding tribal decisions. Overarching all of this was the powerful, inescapable, and defining concept of fate, or word. A person's destiny, especially a warrior's glorious or doomed fate, was believed to be preordained by cosmic forces beyond human control, a predetermined path. The highest virtue for a warrior was not to try to escape one's fate, for that was considered impossible and cowardly, but to face it, especially a violent death in battle, with unflinching, joyful, and reputation-building courage, ensuring entry into the warrior afterlife and eternal fame. This was the complex, formidable, and utterly alien world that Rome first encountered, not as a subject for detached anthropological study, but as a terrifying and tangible existential threat to its very existence and its carefully constructed order. The first great shock came in the late 2nd century BC. Two massive tribal groups, the Cimbri and the Teutones, along with their allies, the Ambrones, began a terrifying mass migration out of their ancestral homes in the Jutland Peninsula. The precise reasons for this epic movement are unclear, but prevailing theories suggest it was likely due to severe coastal flooding, agricultural overpopulation, or possibly relentless pressure from other migrating groups further east, creating a domino effect. They were not an invading army in the conventional sense of a military expedition with clear objectives. They were an entire people on the move, a vast nation of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children with their great ox-drawn wagons, forming mobile fortresses and their vast herds of cattle, providing sustenance along the journey. They were searching for new fertile lands to settle and sustain their growing numbers, a desperate quest for survival. They swept southwards, first clashing with Celtic tribes and other Germanic groups, before finally arriving at the northeastern frontier of the Roman Republic in 113 BC. At the Battle of Noreia in modern Austria, they met a Roman army under the command of a consul and utterly annihilated it, a shocking and humiliating defeat for the Republic. For the next terrifying decade, they became a fearsome specter haunting the Republic, a Gallic tumult reborn, reminding Romans of earlier Celtic incursions and the vulnerability of their homeland. They wandered through Gaul and into Spain, defeating one Roman consular army after another in a string of humiliating and devastating disasters. The Battle of Arausio in 105 BC was a catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed even the legendary disaster. At Cannae, with Roman sources claiming the staggering loss of up to 80,000 soldiers and camp followers in a single day, an unprecedented military catastrophe. A wave of primal fear, the terror Cimbricus, gripped the city of Rome itself, sending shivers down the spines of senators and common citizens alike, fearing for the Republic's very survival. It was this profound national crisis that became The powerful catalyst for the sweeping Marian reforms as the brilliant general Gaius Marius, a new man from outside the traditional aristocracy, forged a new kind of Roman army, a professional, long-service force recruited from the landless, poor, disciplined, and loyal not to the abstract state, but to their charismatic commander, specifically to counter this existential Germanic threat. Finally, Marius, now a national hero elected consul, an unprecedented number of times, cornered and destroyed the migrating peoples in two separate, epic, and horrifically bloody battles. He annihilated the Teutones and Ambrones at Aquisextiae in southern Gaul in 102 BC, and then crushed the Cimbri at Vercellae in northern Italy in 101 BC. Rome had survived its first great Germanic storm, but the psychological scar, the memory of the sheer overwhelming power and terrifying numbers of these northern peoples, would forever linger in the Roman consciousness, a constant reminder of their inherent vulnerability. The next pivotal chapter in the complex and evolving Romano-Germanic relationship belongs to Julius Caesar. While he was systematically conquering Gaul, a process that redefined Roman power and its geographical reach, he found himself inexorably drawn into the volatile affairs of Germania itself as Germanic tribes posed a threat to his newly acquired territory. A powerful and arrogant Suabian king named Ariovistus had led some 120,000 of his people, a vast host of warriors and their families, across the Rhine at the invitation of certain Gallic tribes, ostensibly to aid them in their own internal wars and power struggles. But Ariovistus and his people, having tasted the fertile lands and observed the fractured politics of Gaul, stayed put, seizing the best agricultural land and establishing a formidable kingdom for themselves in Gallic territory, treating the local Gauls as a conquered and subject people and posing a direct challenge to Caesar's authority. Caesar skillfully framing this encroachment as both a direct threat to the security and stability of a newly Romanized Gaul and a personal affront to his own authority and Roman prestige, resolved to confront him directly and decisively. The most famous parley between the two leaders, as recorded and undoubtedly embellished for propaganda purposes by Caesar in his commentaries, is a classic clash of civilizations and utterly opposed worldviews, one of Roman order, the other of Germanic custom. Ariovistus is dramatically portrayed as proud, defiant, and contemptuous of Roman power and diplomacy, boldly claiming the ancient primal right of conquest, arguing with brutal logic that the victorious have an unassailable right to rule the vanquished as they see fit, a universal principle of their warrior culture. Caesar, in turn, deftly postured as the noble defender of his Gallic allies and the righteous champion of Roman order and imperial prestige, a bringer of peace and stability to a chaotic region, masking his own expansionist aims. The confrontations was therefore inevitable and unavoidable, a clash of two titans. At the Battle of the Vosges in 58 BC, Caesar's veteran legions, despite a moment of deep, primal panic among his troops at the sheer ferocity and unfamiliar, wild fighting style of the German warriors, decisively crushed Ariovistus's forces in a brutal hand-to-hand battle, driving the shattered remnants back across the Rhine in a bloody headlong rout. Caesar had not conquered Germania itself, but he had firmly and violently established the Rhine as Rome's definitive, if temporary, frontier. This was a line he would theatrically cross on two other symbolic occasions, building massive, awe-inspiring wooden bridges across the wide river with astonishing speed and engineering prowess. A testament to Roman ingenuity not for lasting conquest, but as a terrifying demonstration of Roman engineering might and military reach. A powerful, chilling warning that no river, no forest, no natural barrier could truly shield the proud tribes from Rome's long and vengeful grasp. A constant reminder of Roman power. But for the ambitious and ever-expanding Roman Empire, A frontier was always perceived as merely a challenge, a line to be crossed and pushed further, never a permanent boundary to its seemingly limitless ambition. Under its first and arguably greatest emperor, Augustus, a grand and audacious strategic plan was conceived to conquer the entirety of Germania all the way to the Elbe River, a massive undertaking that would define an era of imperial expansion and consolidation. This was not just a quest for glory or personal aggrandizement, it was considered sound strategic policy for the newly formed Roman Empire. Conquering the vast territory between the Rhine and the Elbe would dramatically shorten the empire's sprawling northern frontier, making it far more defensible with fewer legions and freeing up vital military resources for service elsewhere in the vast empire. It would also absorb a vast new territory rich in natural resources, ripe for taxation, and, crucially for a perpetually manpower-hungry empire, for the recruitment of new strong soldiers who would replenish the legions. The emperor's brilliant and beloved stepson, Drusus, a general of exceptional talent and charisma, was tasked with this monumental conquest. Between 12 and 9 BC, he led Roman legions deeper into Germania than any Roman had ever ventured, fighting his way through numerous tribal territories, meticulously building a sophisticated network of forts and supply lines, and even sailing a powerful Roman fleet along the treacherous North Sea coast, an unprecedented naval feat that demonstrated Rome's technological superiority and logistical capability. He reached the Elbe, the ultimate geographical goal of the campaign, symbolically marking the furthest Roman advance, but tragically, a fall from his horse proved fatal, cutting short his promising career and leaving the monumental task incomplete. His brother, Tiberius, who would later succeed Augustus as emperor, continued the work with grim methodical efficiency, consolidating gains and suppressing local resistance. By 6 AD, the task seemed all but complete. The vast territory between the Rhine and the Elbe was being systematically organized as a new Roman province, Germania Magna. Roman forts dotted the landscape, new Roman roads were being built to connect them and facilitate troop movement, and a civilian governor was appointed to begin the difficult and delicate work of Romanization, imposing Roman law, introducing Roman administrative structures, and, most hated and alien of all, collecting Roman taxes, which were entirely foreign to the Germanic tribal economy and concept of property, leading to deep resentment. The man appointed as this civilian governor was Publius Quinctilius Verus. He was an experienced administrator, a well-connected nobleman related by marriage to the imperial family, having previously governed the peaceful and long-established province of Syria with success. But his experience was entirely in highly Romanized regions, where the population was accustomed to the hierarchies, bureaucracy, and demands of Roman rule. He was a diplomat and a bureaucrat, a man of paper and law courts, not a battle-hardened frontier. General accustomed to dealing with fierce independent tribes that valued honor above all else and resisted foreign domination. He fundamentally misjudged and openly disdained the proud, independent-minded people he now governed, treating them with a disdainful arrogance and a lack of cultural understanding. He was arrogant, tactless, and deaf to the simmering resentment his policies were creating among the subjugated tribes, failing to see the storm gathering. He failed utterly to understand that Roman legal concepts like state-owned land, direct taxation imposed from afar, and impersonal justice administered by a far-off magistrate were utterly alien and deeply offensive to a people whose entire lives were governed by personal loyalty, ancient tribal custom, and an unyielding sense of warrior honor whose freedom was paramount, and most fatally of all, in a catastrophic error of judgment, born of hubris and misplaced trust, he placed his complete and unshakable confidence in a charismatic young Germanic nobleman who was a prominent and highly regarded member of his personal entourage. Arminius. Arminius was a prince of the Cherusci tribe. As a young boy, he had been taken to Rome, a common practice for the sons of allied or client chiefs, serving as a political hostage to ensure his tribe's good behavior and assimilate him into Roman ways. But he was much more than a mere hostage. He was a Roman investment, a carefully cultivated asset for future imperial administration and a potential Roman leader of his people. He was given a first-class Roman education, learned to speak fluent Latin with eloquence and sophistication, and served with great distinction in the Roman army as the commander of a unit of Germanic auxiliary cavalry, earning Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. For his loyal service, he had been granted the rare and prestigious honor of full Roman citizenship and had been elevated to the equestrian rank, the Roman knightly class, becoming Publius Quinctilius Verus's trusted amicus, friend and client. He was a man of two worlds, perfectly bilingual and bicultural, outwardly Roman, inwardly fiercely Germanic. He knew Rome from the inside out. He understood its military doctrines, its rigid chain of command, its formidable logistical strengths, and, most critically, its psychological and tactical vulnerabilities, a lethal combination of knowledge. As he served under Verus in his own homeland and witnessed firsthand the clumsy, heavy-handed, and oppressive implementation of Roman rule, a powerful conflict must have raged within him, a profound struggle between his adopted identity and his ancestral loyalties, ultimately choosing his people's freedom. The Roman knight, the equestrian, the loyal servant of the emperor, slowly but surely gave way to the Cheruscan prince, the fierce defender of his people's liberty and ancient ways. Secretly, with cold calculation and brilliant deception, he became the hidden architect of a grand and treacherous conspiracy, forging a clandestine alliance between his own Cherusci and several other powerful tribes, all chafing under Verus's insufferable rule and longing for their independence. His meticulously crafted plan was not just to rebel, not just to defeat a Roman army, but to utterly and completely annihilate them, driving Rome from Germania forever and restoring his people's autonomy. The time chosen for this catastrophic trap was the late autumn of the year 9 AD. Verus was leading his three veteran legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, along with numerous auxiliary units and a vast, sprawling baggage train of servants, families, and merchants from their summer encampment in central Germania back toward their permanent winter bases on the Rhine. This was a cumbersome, slow-moving column of over 20,000 people, extending for many kilometers along a narrow, poorly maintained track, entirely unsuitable for such a large and vulnerable force, especially in inclement weather. It was then that Arminius, still perceived as a trusted member of Verus's inner circle and a reliable informant, sprung his meticulously planned trap. He approached the unsuspecting governor with fabricated intelligence, a cunningly devised report of a small local uprising that he claimed needed to be put down immediately to prevent it from spreading and posing a larger threat. He urged Verus to take a detour from the known military road, a path that would lead them directly into the ambush zone, away from open ground. Verus, utterly confident in his own authority and completely trusting his loyal Romanized friend, agreed to the diversion without question, sealing his legion's fate. The detour was a lie. It was designed to lead the entire Roman column away from the open plains where the legions were invincible in their ordered formations, and into the dense, suffocating embrace of the Teutoburger Wald, the Teutoburg forest. It was a landscape Arminius knew intimately, every hidden path, every treacherous bog, every strategic vantage point, a tangled, treacherous maze of dense primeval forest, steep wooded hills, and swampy, rain-soaked bogs. It was a place where the famed discipline, the impenetrable formations, and the heavy infantry tactics of the Roman legions would be rendered utterly useless, where their intrinsic strengths would become fatal weaknesses as the long Roman column snaked its way deeper and deeper into the suffocating confines of the forest. The weather, as if an active, malicious ally to the Germanic conspirators, turned violently against them. A furious, driving rain began to fall, transforming the narrow path into a slick, muddy quagmire that sucked at the soldiers' hobnailed sandals and made every step a Herculean effort, exhausting them prematurely and making orderly movement impossible. The column became dangerously stretched out and fragmented, breaking into disconnected segments as heavy wagons bogged down and men struggled through the increasingly difficult terrain, making coordination and communication impossible. The great trees, ancient and dark, pressed in on all sides, blocking out the sky, obscuring vision, and creating an atmosphere of deep claustrophobic menace and profound disorientation. Then the trap was sprung. Suddenly, without warning, from the wooded high ground on one side of the path, a devastating hail of heavy, iron-tipped javelins rained down upon the unsuspecting and completely unprepared legionaries, piercing shields and flesh. Almost simultaneously, from the shadowy depths of the woods on all sides, the terrifying guttural war cries of thousands of Germanic warriors erupted, a cacophony of sound designed to freeze the blood and shatter any semblance of Roman morale or command, spreading panic through the ranks. In that first overwhelming moment of complete chaos and disorientation, Arminius and his fellow Germanic nobles, who had been riding comfortably with Varus as his trusted escort, spurred their horses, gave a final chillingly false farewell to their Roman victims, and vanished into the forest to take immediate command of their waiting, hidden armies, abandoning their Roman masks forever and revealing their true intentions. It was a perfectly conceived and flawlessly executed ambush, a tactical masterpiece of asymmetric warfare that exploited every Roman vulnerability. The Romans were caught utterly by surprise in the absolute worst possible terrain for their style of fighting, strung out in a long, vulnerable line of march. They could not form their classic tortoise formation, the testudo, to protect themselves from the torrent of missiles. They could not deploy into their devastating checkerboard battle lines their fundamental tactical strength that relied on open ground and precise movements. The legions, the most sophisticated and deadly fighting machine of the ancient world, were rendered almost helpless, their discipline dissolving into individual struggles for survival in the face of the unseen, overwhelming enemy. Their large curved shields, the scuda, became waterlogged and impossibly heavy, useless for rapid movement or tight formation. Their bowstrings, made of animal gut, were soaked by the relentless rain and became slack and useless, leaving their archers impotent. The thick, clinging mud clutched relentlessly at their feet, slowing them down to a miserable crawl and utterly exhausting them with every desperate step. They were fighting a ghost enemy, a phantom army that materialized from the trees to strike with frenzied ferocity, hurling spears, axes, and swords, only to melt back into the shadows and gloom of the forest before any organized Roman counterattack could be mounted. A truly terrifying and demoralizing experience for the disciplined. Legionaries. For 3 agonizing days and nights, the brutal ordeal continued without respite. This was not a battle in any conventional sense of tactical maneuver and counter-maneuver. It was a slow, grinding, mobile slaughter, a relentless attrition of Roman strength and morale. On the second day, the desperate surviving Romans, their ranks already decimated, abandoned their cumbersome baggage train in a frantic effort to gain speed and reach a defensible clearing, where they managed to construct a crude, makeshift, fortified camp for the night, offering brief reprieve. But the attacks were relentless, ceaselessly hammering their exhausted forces from all directions, preventing rest or escape. On the third day, the Roman command structure completely collapsed into disarray as senior leaders fell and communications broke down entirely, leaving the remaining soldiers leaderless, panicked, and isolated. Exhausted, terrified, surrounded on all sides, and with absolutely no hope of escape or relief, Publius Quinctilius Varus chose a Roman death befitting a defeated commander. He fell on his own sword, taking his life to avoid the utter disgrace of capture and ritual sacrifice, a fate worse than death for a Roman general. His senior officers, facing the same grim fate, bravely followed his example, ending their lives with honor. The legionary standards, the sacred silver eagles that were the symbol of each legion's honor, the very soul of Rome's military might, were captured by the triumphant Germanic warriors, a humiliation of the highest order imaginable, a profound blow to Roman pride and religious reverence. Of the 3 legions, a formidable force of some 15,000 to 20,000 trained men, almost no one survived the massacre, a devastating blow to the Roman military. The dead were left unburied, their bones scattered, to be picked apart by the creatures of the forest for years to come, a stark reminder of the disaster. Many of the high-ranking prisoners were, according to Tacitus's later horrific account, tortured and ritually sacrificed to the Germanic gods in the sacred groves, their skulls nailed to trees as a grim and potent warning to any future Roman invaders who dared to tread upon free Germania. The news of the Varian disaster, when it finally reached Rome after agonizing weeks of terrifying uncertainty and desperate rumors, sent a profound shockwave of disbelief, overwhelming grief, and raw, visceral terror throughout the entire empire, from the imperial court to the humblest citizen. The venerable Emperor Augustus, now an old and frail man, was said to have been driven to the very edge of madness by the news, his grand imperial dream shattered and his legacy tarnished. He stopped cutting his hair and beard for months as an outward sign of his deep mourning, a public display of imperial grief that resonated throughout the capital and would reportedly wander the opulent halls of his palace, banging his head against the doors and crying out in an anguished lament that would echo for centuries. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions, duram quintili vare, legions rede, sor. The catastrophic loss of 3 entire legions and their revered eagles was not just a military catastrophe of the first magnitude, it was a deep psychological wound, a national trauma that scarred the Roman psyche for generations, reminding them of their inherent vulnerability despite their immense power. The ambitious dream of a Roman province extending all the way to the Elbe River was shattered forever, a grand imperial vision irrevocably destroyed by the resilience of the Germanic peoples. The Rhine, once seen as a temporary stopping point on the relentless march to further conquest, now became the permanent frontier of the empire in the north, established not by Roman strategic choice, but by the decisive, bloody decree of the victorious Germanic tribes. The myth of Roman invincibility, a cornerstone of their imperial identity and a powerful tool of subjugation, had been definitively broken, and in its place, the powerful, enduring myth of an untamable, freedom-loving Germania, a land that would never bow to an external power, was forcefully born into history. A defiant challenge to Roman supremacy that would shape the future of Europe. Rome, however, was an empire of immense resilience and an unyielding will to power, one that possessed an almost pathological inability to forget its defeats, and it rarely, if ever, forgave its enemies. It demanded swift and brutal vengeance for the insult to its honor and the destruction of its legions. The challenging task of restoring Roman honor and punishing the insolent tribes was given to a charismatic and brilliantly capable young general, the son of the original conqueror Drusus, a man so popular with the army and the common people that he was known universally by the honorific title Germanicus, conqueror of Germans. Between 14 and 16 AD, Germanicus led a series of massive punitive expeditions across the Rhine, crossing the river multiple times with huge, well-equipped forces, demonstrating renewed Roman strength. These were not campaigns of reconquest aiming to reclaim territory for permanent Roman rule. They were brutal campaigns of revenge, meticulously designed to punish the tribes for their audacity, destroy their villages and crops, and brutally restore Roman prestige through overwhelming force and psychological intimidation, ensuring they understood Roman might. He inflicted several heavy defeats on Arminius's coalition, most notably at the Battle of Edistaviso, or the Wasser River, where in open country the superior discipline, training, and equipment of the legions finally prevailed over the fury of the tribesmen, reasserting Roman military prowess. In a moment of profound symbolic importance and grim remembrance, Germanicus led his troops to the very site of the Teutoburg disaster. Tacitus gives a haunting and evocative account of the scene. The Roman soldiers walking in grim silence through the eerie forest, finding the whitened bones of their comrades piled in heaps where they had fallen, the broken weapons, the scattered skeletons of horses, and the grim defiled altars in the sacred groves where the Roman officers had been sacrificed. They gathered the scattered remains of their fallen brethren and buried them in a common mound, a final solemn act of respect and military piety, bringing closure to the Roman dead. During his extensive campaigns, Germanicus even managed to recover 2 of the 3 lost legionary eagles from the tribes, a major propaganda victory that was celebrated wildly in Rome with immense relief, symbolic of Roman honor being restored. But his successes came at a huge cost in men and resources, and his fleet was nearly destroyed in a massive storm on the North Sea, highlighting the persistent dangers and logistical difficulties of campaigning in the region. The Emperor Tiberius, ever cautious, pragmatic, and perhaps deeply jealous of Germanicus's soaring popularity, grew increasingly wary of the immense costs and the persistent risks of another Varian-style disaster in the treacherous German lands. In 16 AD, he decisively recalled Germanicus to Rome, awarding him a magnificent triumph, but explicitly forbidding any further large-scale campaigns across the Rhine. The strategic decision was final and irrevocable. Germania was simply not worth the unsustainable price in Roman blood and imperial gold. Rome would henceforth fortify the frontier, engage in diplomacy and trade where possible, and reluctantly accept its strategic limits in the north, focusing instead on internal stability and other imperial priorities in more manageable regions. The 2 centuries that followed from the reign of Hadrian to the onset of the devastating 3rd century crisis were not a period of idyllic peace, but rather one of a long, complex, and constantly evolving stalemate along this newly defined frontier. This border, known as the Limes Germanicus, became a permanent, heavily militarized feature of the European landscape, a vast defensive network. It was not a single great continuous stone wall like Hadrian's Wall in distant Britain, but a sophisticated layered system of defenses. It comprised earthen banks, deep V-shaped ditches, wooden palisades, stone watchtowers built at regular intervals, and massive legionary fortresses, stretching for over 500 kilometers from the mouth of the Rhine in the Netherlands to the upper Danube in modern Bavaria, a monumental engineering feat. But this border was never hermetic. It was a porous membrane, a dynamic zone of intense and continuous interaction between 2 distinct worlds, Roman and Germanic. There was constant, mutually beneficial trade, luxurious Roman goods like fine wines, exquisite red-gloss pottery, terra sigillata, delicate glass vessels, and sophisticated metal tools flowed into Germania, reshaping local economies and desires, and leading to a degree of Romanization of Germanic elites who valued these foreign luxuries. In return, the Romans imported vast quantities of raw materials and valuable commodities from the Germanic lands, including slaves, cattle, timber, furs, leather, human hair for wigs, and the highly prized northern amber, which was valued more. than gold in Rome. And more importantly, there was a profound military and cultural osmosis. The Roman army, perpetually short of its own citizens for recruitment into its legions, began to rely more and more heavily on hiring Germanic warriors to man its auxiliary units and defend its own borders. These Germanic warriors, serving as auxiliary units or as larger tribal groups known as foederati or federates, allies given grants of land and payment in exchange for military service, fought for Roman pay, were equipped with Roman arms and armor, and critically, learned Roman tactics and military organization, subtly transforming the very nature of the Roman army from within, making it increasingly Germanic in its composition. In the short term, this was a practical and cost-effective solution to a chronic manpower problem that plagued the empire. In the long term, it would prove to be a fatal policy. Rome was essentially training and equipping its own future conquerors, integrating them into its core military structures, and giving them an intimate, first-hand understanding of the empire's strengths, its intricate logistics, and its underlying weaknesses, creating a powerful adversary. The barbarization of the late Roman army was a slow, inexorable process, a gradual dilution of its traditional Roman core, leading to a military force that was powerful, but increasingly alien to its original identity. Increasingly powerful Germanic leaders, men of immense ambition and tactical acumen, began to rise to positions of high command within the imperial military system itself, sometimes even becoming magistri militum, masters of soldiers, the highest military rank and de facto commanders-in-chief of the empire. Men like Stilicho, who was half Vandal, and Arbogast, a Frank, would become the de facto rulers of the Western Empire in its twilight years, effectively controlling the emperors and setting policy, their loyalties often profoundly torn between their Germanic heritage and their sworn Roman duty. A complex internal conflict. As the 3rd and 4th centuries AD progressed, the world on both sides of the limes was changing dramatically, accelerating towards an inevitable collision that would reshape the entire continent. The Roman Empire entered its monumental crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of near-fatal instability, racked by endless civil war between rival claimants to the purple, devastating hyperinflation that crippled its economy and shattered its currency, recurring and devastating plagues that decimated the population, and constant usurpations of the imperial throne by short-lived emperors. The empire nearly tore itself apart from within, bleeding resources and manpower from its core, leaving it vulnerable. At the same time, the Germanic world to the north and east was undergoing a profound transformation of its own. The small, scattered individual tribes that Tacitus had described 2 centuries earlier began to coalesce through both conquest and strategic alliance into larger, more powerful, and far more dangerous tribal confederations. These were not just temporary alliances of convenience. They were evolving into new, stable, and formidable political entities capable of challenging Rome directly and sustaining long-term warfare. On the Upper Rhine, various Germanic groups merged to become the Alemanni, whose name tellingly meant all men, signifying their diverse origins and collective power, a new and aggressive force. On the Lower Rhine, a similar powerful confederation arose known as the Franks, whose name, perhaps from an old German word for free or fierce, would give its name to a modern nation, France. And far to the east, on the great fertile plains north of the Black Sea, the Goths, who had migrated from their ancestral lands in Scandinavia centuries earlier, had established a powerful settled kingdom. They were not mere nomadic raiders. They had developed a sophisticated culture, absorbed many aspects of the local Sarmatian and Roman provincial cultures, developed their own written language, Gothic with its own alphabet, and converted to Arian Christianity, a distinct theological branch of the faith. They were becoming a sophisticated semi-Romanized state in their own right, a mirror image of Rome's power and a potential rival, now organized and powerful. The pressure on the weakened and increasingly overstretched Roman frontiers was mounting relentlessly from all directions, like water building behind a cracking dam, threatening to burst and unleash a flood of peoples. Then, in the latter half of the 4th century, a new and utterly terrifying force exploded out of the vast, mysterious steppes of Central Asia, a force that would act as the ultimate, unpredictable catalyst for the final irreversible shattering of the old world order. The Huns. We know frustratingly little of their true origins or their specific ethnic composition, but their sudden, violent arrival in Europe around 370 AD was like a meteor strike, sending shockwaves of panic and displacement across the entire continent, from the Black Sea to the Rhine. They were a nomadic people of consummate horsemen, living their entire lives in the saddle, and their military tactics centered on the devastating power of the composite reflex bow, fired with incredible accuracy. From horseback, were unlike anything the more conventionally organized Goths or Romans had ever faced, giving them a decisive advantage. They were masters of lightning-fast raids, brutal siege warfare, which they quickly learned from their subjects, and cunning psychological manipulation, their feigned retreats, sowing terror and confusion among their enemies. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who provides our most vivid and horrified account, described them with undisguised disgust as a bestial, almost inhuman race, with stunted bodies and misshapen faces from early skull binding, living entirely on their horses, eating their meat raw after tenderizing it under their saddles, and being so prodigiously ugly and bent that they might be two-legged animals. A perception born of fear and xenophobia. They first smashed the powerful kingdom of the Alans, a non-Germanic nomadic steppe people, absorbing many of them into their horde. And then they fell upon the mighty Gothic Empire north of the Black Sea, shattering it completely and sending its various factions fleeing in disarray. This cataclysm triggered a massive, uncontrollable domino effect, a profound shockwave of displacement that sent panicked peoples fleeing westward in terror from the relentless Hunnic onslaught. This is the true beginning of the Great Migration. Period, the Völkerwanderung, often romantically translated as the wandering of the peoples, a period of unprecedented demographic upheaval that would permanently reshape the face of Europe. It was not a coordinated invasion of the Roman Empire, but a desperate, terrified flight of millions of refugees seeking safety and new homes from the relentless Hunnic terror, inadvertently bringing down the Roman system in the process. The Goths, now split into two main groups, the Visigoths, Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, Eastern Goths, were the first of the major Germanic peoples to be crushed and displaced by this terrifying Hunnic wave. In the summer of 376 AD, a huge multitude of Visigoths, a desperate nation with their families, their wagons, and their few remaining possessions, led by their chieftain Fritigern, appeared on the northern bank of the majestic Danube River, the empire's eastern frontier. They were not an invading army, but a nation in despair, begging the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the river and settle peacefully in Roman territory as foederati, offering to serve in the Roman army in exchange for land, and desperately needed protection from the Huns. Valens, seeing a potential source of desperately needed military recruits for his overstretched empire, agreed to their plea, a decision that would prove catastrophic for him. But the operation was catastrophically mismanaged by corrupt and cruel Roman officials. They exploited the refugees mercilessly, stole their supplies, and in a famous and horrifying detail recorded by Ammianus, forced the starving Goths to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for a meager amount of dog meat, a profound insult and betrayal that ignited their fury. Humiliated, starving, and profoundly betrayed, the desperate Visigoths, led by Fritigern, rose up in a furious and justified rebellion against their Roman oppressors, their former allies setting the Balkans ablaze. In the summer of 378 A.D., near Sophoho, the city of Adrianople in Thrace, the Emperor Valens, rashly deciding to seek a glorious and decisive victory without waiting for promised reinforcements from the Western Roman Empire, led the main Eastern Roman field army to crush them once and for all. The result was a disaster that eclipsed even the Teutoburg forest in its devastating scale. The disciplined Roman heavy infantry, tired and thirsty after a long march under a hot Thracian sun, was unexpectedly charged on its exposed flank and rear by the powerful Gothic heavy cavalry, which had been away foraging and returned at the critical moment, smashing into the Roman lines. The Roman formations collapsed into chaos, and the army was surrounded and massacred. The Emperor Valens himself was killed, his body never found, and two-thirds of his entire veteran army was utterly destroyed on the field. Adrianople was a cataclysmic turning point in military history. It proved beyond any doubt that a barbarian army on its own terms and with superior cavalry tactics could decisively defeat a full-strength Roman imperial army in a pitched, open battle. The long-held myth of Roman tactical and military superiority was shattered forever, exposing the empire's profound vulnerability and signaling a definitive shift in military dominance. For the next several tumultuous decades, the Visigoths, now a mobile, armed nation-state within the very borders of the empire, wandered through the Roman Balkans, a fearsome force oscillating between fighting for the empire as uneasy allies and ruthlessly plundering its rich provinces when their demands for land and sustenance were not met. Under their brilliant and ambitious new king, Alaric, who had himself served in the Roman army and understood its strengths and weaknesses, they sought a permanent home, official titles, and regular payment from the recalcitrant Roman authorities. When the Western Roman court, now safely ensconced in the marsh-protected city of Ravenna, repeatedly reneged on its promises and deliberately insulted Alaric, he made a fateful and history-altering decision, driven by both grievance and ambition. He marched his army down the Italian peninsula, bypassing Roman strongholds and terrorizing the countryside, cutting off vital supplies to the capital, and then did the unthinkable. In August of 410 AD, after a series of sieges and protracted negotiations that broke down, he laid siege to and dramatically captured the city of Rome itself. For the first time in 800 years, since the Gauls had done so in 390 BC, the one eternal city, the symbolic heart of the entire Western world, fell to a foreign foe. The sack itself was relatively mild by the brutal standards of the age. Alaric, being a Christian, though of the Arian sect, which mainstream Catholics considered heretical, he was still a Christian and ordered his men to spare church buildings, and those who took refuge there ordered his men to spare the city's great basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, and the actual looting lasted only 3 days. But the profound psychological impact that reverberated across the entire Mediterranean world was immense, shaking the very foundations of Roman belief in their own divine destiny and invincibility. Saint Jerome, receiving the news in his monastery in Bethlehem, famously lamented, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken," articulating the universal shock. St. Augustine, in his city of Hippo in North Africa, was prompted to write his monumental masterpiece, The City of God, specifically to explain how the earthly city could fall while the heavenly city remained eternal and inviolate, providing a theological framework for a new age. It was an unambiguous signal to everyone, from emperors to peasants, that the Western Roman Empire was a hollowed-out shell, its once indomitable power now a phantom, its prestige utterly broken. After the sack, the Visigoths moved on, eventually, being settled by the Romans as foederati in southern Gaul, a large chunk of Aquitaine, where they were meant to be allies. From there, they expanded their power into the Iberian Peninsula, driving out other Germanic tribes, and established the great Visigothic kingdom, a powerful and influential successor state that would rule much of Spain for the next 300 years, leaving a lasting imprint on its culture, architecture, and legal system. Even before Alaric's sack of Rome, another mortal blow had been struck against the Western Empire, initiating a chain of events that proved irreversible and hastened its decline. On the freezing cold New Year's Eve of 406 AD, with Roman troops having been critically withdrawn from the vulnerable Rhine frontier to deal with pressing threats in Italy, the great river froze solid, creating a natural vast bridge that invited passage. A vast mixed wave of Germanic peoples, most prominently the Vandals, the Suebi, and their non-Germanic allies, the Alans, poured across the ice into the largely undefended province of Gaul, leaving a trail of fire and utter destruction in their wake, a path of scorched earth, ruined cities, and widespread chaos. This moment marked the true beginning of the end for Roman Gaul, as central imperial control collapsed. Of these myriad groups, the Vandals embarked on the most extraordinary and unexpected odyssey of the entire migration period, a journey of incredible endurance and strategic daring that defied expectations. Led by their exceptionally cunning, ruthless, and militarily brilliant king, Gaiseric, they fought their way through the length of Gaul, constantly battling other tribes and Roman forces, crossed the formidable Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, devastating the peninsula and establishing a foothold. And then, in a stroke of strategic genius in 429 AD, they built a fleet and transported their entire people, some 80,000 strong, across the Strait of Gibraltar into the rich and prosperous provinces of Roman North Africa. This region was the undisputed breadbasket of the Western Empire, the vital source of much of Rome's essential grain supply and a huge percentage of its tax revenue, making its loss catastrophic. Within a mere decade, Gaiseric had conquered the entire province, capturing the great city of Carthage in 439 AD and establishing a powerful, independent Vandal kingdom, controlling crucial sea lanes and severely disrupting Roman trade. He built a formidable navy and turned his people into the masters of the Mediterranean, launching devastating pirate raids on Roman sea lanes and coastal cities, causing immense disruption and economic hardship that further crippled the Roman state. In 455 AD, it was Gaiseric's turn to sack Rome, and his Vandal fleet did so far more thoroughly and destructively than Alaric's Goths had, systematically stripping the city of its remaining treasures over a prolonged period of 2 weeks, carrying away massive amounts of loot by sea. The very word vandalism is a direct, if somewhat unfair legacy of their fearsome reputation and the shock their actions caused across the Roman world. Meanwhile, the Huns, who had set this whole massive avalanche of peoples in motion, continued their devastating campaigns and reached the terrifying zenith of their power under their most famous leader, Attila, famously known to the Romans as the Scourge of God. In 451 AD, Attila led his vast horde, which ironically included many subjugated Germanic peoples like the Ostrogoths, fighting under his command, on a massive invasion of Gaul, aiming to subjugate the remaining Roman and Germanic kingdoms there and establish a Hunnic empire. In one of the pivotal and bloodiest battles of late antiquity, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, a combined Roman and Germanic army, led by the astute Roman general Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, and the valiant Visigothic King Theodoric the Farnsters, who was tragically killed in the fierce fighting, fought Attila's forces to a bloody standstill. It was a chaotic battle of nations, a true world war of the ancient world, where Roman fought alongside Visigoth and Frank against Hun, Ostrogoth, and other Germanic peoples, united only by their common fear of Attila's wrath. The battle, though indecisive in terms of a clear winner, succeeded in halting the Hunnish advance into the heart of Western Europe, preventing a total collapse of Roman power. The following year, Attila invaded Italy itself, sacking many cities and causing widespread panic, but he was famously persuaded to turn back from sacking Rome by a legendary embassy led by Pope Leo I, perhaps due to a combination of skillful diplomacy, a severe outbreak of disease in his army, and the strategic threat of an Eastern Roman attack on his supply lines. Shortly after, in 453 A.D., Attila died unexpectedly on his wedding night, likely from a burst blood vessel or alcohol poisoning. His vast personal empire, held together only by his sheer charisma and brutal terror, collapsed as quickly as it had arisen, as his squabbling sons fought among themselves, and their many subject peoples rose in swift rebellion, reclaiming their hard-won freedom and ending the Hunnic threat to Europe forever. The Western Roman Empire itself was now in its final agonizing death throes. Real power was no longer held by the sequence of often short-lived and feeble emperors residing in the marsh-protected city of Ravenna, a city chosen for its defensibility rather than its inherent power or influence. Instead, power rested with a succession of powerful Germanic warlords who held the Roman military title of Magister Militum, or Master of Soldiers. These men, like the powerful Ricimer and the Burgundian Gondobad, were the true puppet masters, effectively controlling the empire and appointing and deposing emperors at will without any lasting loyalty to the Roman state or its institutions. They were more interested in personal power and tribal advantage than in preserving the Roman system. The final, almost anticlimactic act came in the year 476 A.D. The commander of the Roman army in Italy, a Germanic chieftain of the Syri tribe named Odoacer, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, a symbolic end to a great empire. But instead of proclaiming himself or another puppet as the new emperor, Odoacer did something unprecedented and deeply symbolic. He had the imperial insignia of the West, the diadem, the purple robe, and the scepter, carefully packed up and formally sent to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, along with a message stating that the West no longer required an emperor of its own, and that one emperor, based in the East, was sufficient for the whole Roman world. This act of symbolic reunification, though largely ignored by the East, signaled the definitive end of an era, marking the end of the line of Western Roman emperors. Though at the time it may not have seemed like a single cataclysmic event to the average Roman citizen, for most people, life did not change overnight, the taxman still called, and the local bishop still held sway, offering continuity. History has chosen to mark the year 476 A.D. as the symbolic fall of the Western Roman Empire, signaling the definitive end of direct Roman imperial rule in the West, and the beginning of a new complex chapter for Europe, marked by the emergence of Germanic kingdoms. The political superstructure of the West was gone, fragmented into smaller, independent entities, but life, culture, and society remarkably went on, adapting and transforming in fascinating ways. In its place, a new and vibrant order was slowly emerging, a patchwork mosaic of dynamic Germanic successor kingdoms built upon the administrative and cultural ruins of the former Roman provinces. In Italy, Odoacer's rule was eventually ended by Theodoric the Great, the formidable king of the Ostrogoths, who, with the blessing of the Eastern Emperor, invaded and conquered Italy in the 490s, establishing a powerful Ostrogothic kingdom. Theodoric, who had spent his youth as a hostage in Constantinople and deeply admired Roman civilization and its administrative efficiency, ruled with great wisdom and a vision of harmonious coexistence between Goths and Romans. He meticulously attempted to create a dual system where his Goths provided military protection and formed the warrior elite, loyal to him, while the Roman administrative class, including intellectual figures like the philosopher Boethius and the historian Cassiodorus, continued to run the civil government, maintaining Roman law for Roman citizens and Gothic law for Goths. His long reign from his magnificent capital at Ravenna was a brief, bright golden age of peace, remarkable reconstruction, and renewed stability for the battered Italian peninsula, a testament to his unique leadership and statesmanship that unfortunately did not outlast him, as the Eastern Roman Empire would later attempt to reconquer Italy. Meanwhile, in the north, the Franks, a confederation of tribes who had been gradually expanding from their homeland on the lower Rhine under their brilliant, cunning, and utterly ruthless king, Clovis of the Merovingian dynasty, were forging what would become the most powerful and durable of all the Germanic successor states. Clovis methodically and brutally united the various Frankish tribes under his singular authority, often through assassination or conquest, and then systematically conquered his rivals one by one, including the last pocket of Roman rule in Gaul, the domain of Soissons, and the Arian Visigoths in southern Gaul, pushing them into Spain. But his most decisive and history-shaping act was one of profound political and religious genius. While most other Germanic kings were Arian Christians, a theological sect viewed as dangerously heretical by the majority Catholic Romanized population of Gaul, Clovis astutely recognized the immense institutional power and widespread popular support of the Catholic Church and its bishops. Around the year 496, he, along with thousands of his elite warriors, converted directly to Catholic Christianity, being baptized in a grand and highly symbolic ceremony at Reims by Bishop Remigius. This single strategic act immediately won him the fervent support of the Gallo-Roman aristocracy and the powerful network of Catholic bishops who provided administrative expertise and crucial legitimacy, allowing him to portray his subsequent wars of conquest against the Arian Visigoths and Alemanni not as naked aggression, but as holy wars to liberate his co-religionists from heretical rule. By the time of his death, he had created a vast and unified Frankish kingdom that encompassed almost all of modern France, Belgium, and Western Germany. This powerful Catholic kingdom would become the undisputed heartland of medieval Europe, from which the glorious Carolingian Empire would later emerge, building directly on his foundations and shaping the continent's future, political and religious landscape across the English Channel. A slower, murkier, but equally profound transformation was taking place, one that would give rise to the English nation and its distinctive culture. After the Roman legions officially withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century to defend a collapsing Gaul from the incessant barbarian invasions, the island's Romano-British inhabitants were left largely defenseless against relentless raids from the Picts in the north and the Irish from the west, leading to a period of chaos and decline. According to tradition, as recorded by the British monk Gildas in his lament, De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, and later by the Anglo-Saxon historian Bede in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, the Romano-British leaders made a fatal error. They invited Germanic mercenaries from the continent, traditionally identified as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, to help defend them. But the mercenaries, seeing a fertile and politically fractured land ripe for the taking, soon turned on their desperate employers, beginning a centuries-long process of invasion, conquest, and widespread settlement. They relentlessly pushed the native Celtic-speaking Britons to the western fringes of the island, into what would become Wales and Cornwall, and across the sea to Brittany and Gaul, establishing a distinct cultural divide. In the rich eastern and southern lands they conquered, they established a series of small warring kingdoms, famously known to later history as the Heptarchy, a term for 7 kingdoms, though the number fluctuated constantly and regions often vied for supremacy, with powerful overlords rising and falling. Over many centuries, these independent kingdoms would, under pressure from devastating Viking invasions from the 9th century onward, eventually coalesce into a single, unified kingdom. Angleland, or England, a distinct new entity forged from this turmoil of invasion and cultural clash, adopting a new language and identity. Their vibrant warrior culture, with its rich oral traditions, its elaborate metalwork, and its heroic ethos, is immortalized in the magnificent treasures of burials like Sutton Hoo, with its awe-inspiring ship burial for a great Anglo-Saxon lord, a perfect embodiment of the heroic Germanic world described in their epic poem Beowulf, a foundational work of English literature and a window into their worldview. By the 8th century, the political and cultural map of Western Europe had been completely and irrevocably redrawn. The Visigoths ruled Spain until their swift conquest by the Umayyad Caliphate from North Africa in 701, further transforming the peninsula. The Franks dominated Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons controlled most of Britain, and the Lombards, another formidable Germanic tribe who had invaded in 568, ruled much of Italy. This was not, however, a simple replacement of one ruling people by another, a mere changing of the guard, as the Romans had once done in their conquests. It was a complex, dynamic, and organic process of fusion, of acculturation, and of mutual adaptation, a blending of disparate elements into something new and enduring. The new Germanic ruling class was almost always a tiny minority, a powerful warrior aristocracy ruling over a vast, still largely Romanized populace. The new societies that emerged from this long, tumultuous process were a profound hybrid, a creative and powerful synthesis of three essential, intertwined elements: the Germanic warrior culture, with its emphasis on personal loyalty, martial prowess, and customary oral law; the enduring legacy of Roman administration, urban planning, infrastructure, and the Latin language, which remained the language of the church, learning, and the elite; and the increasingly dominant unifying force of Latin, Catholic Christianity, championed by the growing power of the papacy in Rome. New legal codes, like the Salic law of the Franks, were laboriously written down in Latin, but meticulously codified ancient Germanic customs, especially the intricate system of the Vergil, brilliantly blending two distinct legal traditions into something new and functional, a testament to legal innovation. The languages themselves were profoundly transformed. The vulgar Latin spoken by the masses in Gaul, Spain, and Italy, infused with hundreds of Germanic words, particularly those related to warfare, social structure, and farming, eventually evolved into the early Romance languages that are the ancestors of modern French, Spanish, and Italian. In Britain and Germany, by contrast, the sheer numerical dominance of Germanic settlers meant that Germanic dialects almost completely supplanted the native Latin and Celtic languages, becoming the direct ancestors of modern English and German respectively. The very fabric of European thought and identity was being rewoven, creating a new cultural tapestry that bore the distinct marks of both its Roman and Germanic heritage. A unique synthesis, this long, turbulent, and world-shaping age, this entire era of destruction and profound creation, finds its ultimate culmination and grand synthesis in the towering, almost mythical figure of one man, Charles, King of the Franks, known to all of history as Charlemagne or Charles the Great. A direct descendant of Clovis and a member of the powerful Carolingian dynasty that had seized control of the Frankish kingdom, Charlemagne was a figure of legendary energy, boundless ambition, and profound foresight, a true visionary who understood the desperate need for order and unity after centuries of fragmentation and chaos. He was a relentless and brilliantly effective military conqueror, expanding his realm through sheer force of will and overwhelming military might, often leading his armies personally, a pious and reforming Christian, deeply committed to the church, and vigorously Christianizing his new domains, often by brutal force, and a great patron of learning and the arts who sparked what is known as the Carolingian Renaissance, a crucial revival of classical scholarship, literacy, and monastic culture. In the West, after centuries of steep decline, laying the intellectual groundwork for medieval Europe, in a series of over 50 relentless military campaigns, he vastly expanded the Frankish kingdom, forging an empire that united almost all of Western Christendom under his single, powerful rule. He conquered the Lombards in Italy, bringing the peninsula under his direct control and establishing Frankish dominance over the papacy. He brutally subjugated and forcibly converted the pagan Saxons in northern Germany in a decades-long bloody war, integrating them into his Christian empire through a harsh policy of conversion or death and mass baptisms. And he destroyed the powerful Avar Khanate in modern-day Hungary, securing his eastern flank and enriching his treasury with vast amounts of captured Avar gold, funding his reforms. By the turn of the 9th century, he had created an empire that rivaled the old Western Roman Empire itself in its geographic scope, its administrative ambition, and its audacious claim to universal authority, a true successor to the Caesars, recognized by the Church, and then on Christmas Day, in the momentous year 800 A.D., in the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer before the high altar, a scene pregnant with historical significance and carefully orchestrated. Symbolism, Pope Leo III stepped forward and dramatically placed an imperial crown upon his head. The assembled congregation, likely arranged beforehand for maximum dramatic and political effect, erupted in thunderous applause and acclaimed him in a resonant Latin chant, Carolo Augusto, a Deo coronato, magno et pacifico imperatori Romanorum. Icapetimer icamorhast, itatie, Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving, Emperor of the Romans. This electrifying moment was the symbolic capstone of the entire era, a powerful declaration that a new, independent, and divinely sanctioned empire had been born in the West, truly arising from the ashes of Rome and the dynamism of the Germanic peoples. It was an empire that was consciously Roman in its imperial pretensions and its administrative aspirations, profoundly Christian in its spiritual identity and aspirations, drawing its legitimacy from the Church, and yet fundamentally and undeniably Germanic in its leadership, its military power, its evolving legal customs, and its underlying social foundations. It was a testament to the enduring power of synthesis, a new beginning for Europe, establishing a template for future medieval empires, the long, chaotic, and utterly world-changing journey of the Germanic peoples, which began in the prehistoric seas, mists of Scandinavia and on the cold, windswept plains of northern Germany, had finally reached its apotheosis. From scattered, feuding tribes living in humble wooden longhouses on the periphery of the known world, they had risen through centuries of struggle, adaptation, profound transformation, and strategic maneuvering to become the masters and the true inheritors of Western Europe. They had been the restless, dynamic force that, over centuries, systematically dismembered and finally toppled the Western Roman Empire. But from its fallen stones, its enduring laws, its administrative innovations, and its powerful, evocative memory, they, in a complex and often unconscious partnership with the Romanized peoples they ruled and the universal church that increasingly guided them, had built a new, resilient civilization that would define the Middle Ages. The great Völkerwanderung, the wandering of the peoples, was over. The foundations of the Middle Ages, and of the very nations that would one day rise to global prominence, were now securely and irrevocably laid. The world of the Germanic tribes, with its tales of daring warriors, profound migrations, and cultural clashes, may seem to us like a distant, dark age of relentless violence and profound upheaval, a time of barbarians and ruin. But in truth, it is the living, breathing bedrock upon which our own modern world stands, a testament to their enduring legacy that shaped our continent and continues to resonate in our languages, our laws, our customs, and our very way of life today. Their epic centuries-long story is, in a very real, tangible, and fundamental way, the foundational narrative of how the West began, a story that deserves to be fully understood, meticulously studied, and profoundly appreciated.